Hello, this is Domenico Composto with Easynomics, and this is a second video looking at the marginal revenue equals marginal cost rule in order to maximize profit. In a previous video, we looked at how this rule applies to perfectly competitive market structures. And now we're going to look at this profit maximization rule, where MR equals MC, as applied to the following market structures. It could be applied to monopolies, oligopolies, monopolistically competitive firms. And these three market structures are similar in terms of the demand curve that is now downward sloping. All right, so in these market structures, demand slopes down. All right, as opposed to a perfectly competitive market structure where the demand curve is perfectly elastic. And in that previous video, we highlighted how demand equals the marginal benefit, which is equal to average revenue, which is equal to marginal revenue. That was for perfect competition. But this is different for perfectly competitive market structures. No longer is average revenue and marginal revenue equal. So for these three market structures, since demand slopes downward, we see that AR does not equal MR. Okay, so here we have our very elastic demand curve. So this is kind of reflective of a monopolistic competitive market structure that since they face substitutes of competition, their demand curve would be fairly elastic. And so we would label that as D1, which we know is equal to the marginal benefit. Demand always equal to the marginal benefit. We can also state that it's equal to the average revenue. And we know that average revenue is equal to total revenue divided by the quantity of output, which is another way of saying price times quantity divided by quantity. And these cancel. So essentially, AR equals price, which makes sense that our demand curve reflects the prices that consumers are willing and able to spend on a particular good or service. So to simplify this, we're going to label demand is equal to marginal benefit equal to AR, which we can also say is equal to price. So I'm just going to eliminate this. And in the previous video, I highlighted that. So again, demand equals marginal benefit equal to AR, which equals price. Okay, we'll just say that's price one, or various prices along the demand curve. But the marginal revenue curve we see is less than the average revenue curve. No longer are these two equal. We see that AR is greater than MR. And I'll probably create another video to explain that in more detail. This video is not going to really focus on why the AR is greater than the MR. We're going to have to get into the fact that we're assuming that firms are not price discriminating and what's the impact as a lower price for their consumers. That's a topic for another video. So for now, we just need to know that MR is less than AR for any downward sloping demand curve. The two diverge from each other. Okay? So looking at this rule for profit maximization, the firm will profit maximize where MR equals MC, and that will determine the level of output. So in graph one, we're looking at a parabola, which is our profit curve function, and we're measuring profit on the y-axis. Profit is equal to pi. Pi is the symbol for profit in economics. And on the x-axis, we're measuring the quantity of output. In graph two, we're measuring revenue and costs and prices on the y-axis, more specifically looking at marginal revenue and marginal cost, as well as price, and we're looking at the quantity of output produced by the firm. Here we see that our supply curve is this red line here. Supply is upward sloping according to law of supply, where S1 equals our marginal cost of production, the additional cost of producing an additional unit of output. And we have our demand curve downward sloping according to the law of demand. Demand is equal to our marginal benefit, which is equal to our average revenue, which is essentially equal to price. All of the prices along our demand curve that consumers are willing and able to pay for a particular good or service. And then we have our marginal revenue curve that's also downward sloping, and MR is less than AR because we're assuming that the firm is not price discriminating. And again, that will be the topic for another video. And we can go ahead and start looking at where the firm maximizes their profit. So let's look at the output at Q1. Okay, so we see that when the firm is producing at a quantity of Q1, we'll notice that their marginal cost at point A is less than their marginal revenue, right? I'm touching this blue line, which is my marginal revenue. Thus, that signals that the firm can afford to produce more output, right? Since again, we see that at Q1, the marginal revenue, the additional revenue gain from producing an additional level of output is greater than the additional cost of producing that additional unit of output. So at Q1, since MR is greater than MC, that would signal to the firm to go ahead and increase production along their supply curve. So they increase output, let's say to Q2, all right? And we see that at Q2, now the marginal revenue, again, we're touching that the blue line, which is our marginal revenue, is now equal to our marginal cost. So here we see that MR equals MC. And in terms of the profit curve function, we see that we're moving from this point A to this point B. Profit is increasing, and then it's been maximized at point B. Why? Well, let's see what happens if the firm continues to produce more output beyond the quantity of Q2. So if they produced along their supply curve or their marginal cost curve from point B to point C, generating a level of output at Q3, we see that at Q3, the marginal cost now at point C is greater than the marginal revenue at this point over here. So the marginal cost of that production is greater than the marginal revenue. The additional cost of producing that additional level of output greater than the additional revenue gained, which means that it's going to eat into profits. So from Q2, we see that profits begins to decline to point C. That would signal to the firm that they should reduce production from point C or from Q3 back to Q2 to reduce the marginal cost being greater than the marginal revenue to get to a point where at least the MR is equal to MC. Thus, where MR equals MC at a quantity of Q2, the profit has been maximized. Okay, this is an explanation of this rule. All right. So profit maximization, that is going to be the assumption of firms' objective when we graph the market structures of perfect competition, monopolistic competition, monopoly, and oligopoly. An alternative objective of the firm is revenue maximization, which we've discussed in another video. And the rule for revenue maximization is to produce where MR equals 0, because that's where the total revenue function is at maximum. But again, that was covered in another video. So quickly, I'll go ahead and analyze this. This is not necessarily a model that you'd be using for an IB exam. It's just to illustrate the MR equals MC rule, but I'll just go ahead and analyze it anyway, just to emphasize this rule. As can be seen, we have graph 1. Graph 1 is illustrating or measuring profit on the y-axis and the quantity of output on the x-axis. We notice that the profit curve function is a parabola. And in graph 2, we're measuring revenue and costs and prices on the y-axis, or more specifically, the marginal revenue and the marginal cost of a firm. And we're measuring the quantity of output on the x-axis. We notice that we have two downward sloping revenue curves. We have a demand curve downward sloping according to law of demand, equal to, which is labeled D1, equal to our marginal benefit, which is equal to our average revenue, was essentially equal to price, the price that consumers are willing and able to pay for a particular good or service. And we also have a downward sloping marginal revenue curve labeled MR, and we notice that the AR is greater than the MR because we're going to assume that the firm is not price discriminating. Okay. That being said, we're going to look at this firm operating where MR equals MC to maximize profit. And we're going to start at a quantitative output at Q1. And along their supply curve at point A, we notice that at Q1 that the marginal revenue, the additional revenue gained, is greater than the additional cost of producing that amount of output, which is reflected in the profit curve function in graph 1 at point A. This incentivizes the firm to increase output from Q1 to Q2. They're moving along their supply curve from point A to point B. And they, again, here they're producing where MR equals MC, MR at point B equal to MC. And there we see that since the additional revenue is equal to the additional cost of producing that level of output, they have maximized profit. So on the profit curve function in graph 1, they've moved from point A to point B. If the firm was to continue to increase output from Q2 to Q3 along their supply curve, operating at point C, here we see that the marginal cost is greater than the marginal revenue. The additional cost of producing that level of output is greater than the additional revenue, which means that it would eat into profits, and then profit would be declining, as we see in our profit curve function from point B to point C. Thus, the firm should decrease the quantity supplied from Q3 to Q2, moving from point C to point B on the profit curve function so that they have maximized profit where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to comment, and don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.